Why is romance the best-selling genre? Of course, people love love, so obviously there's that. But one thing about a romance is that it has inherent anticipation. Even if you're a pretty amateurish writer and you're not that great at plotting or pacing, just in undertaking a romance as your genre, you're inherently baking anticipation into the premise of the novel. And a lot of the most popular genres of romance have an added layer of anticipation, like enemies to lovers. Not only are you anticipating the love story, but you're anticipating how an enemy is going to become a lover. Arranged marriage, you're inherently wondering, how are these two people who have been kind of forced to get together? How are they going to get along? And if you look at some of the other very popular genre types of novels that people devour quickly, like thriller, mystery, they also have inherent anticipation in the premise of the novel. One thing about literary fiction, as well as science fiction and fantasy, they don't have quite the level of built-in anticipation inherent in the plot that romance, thriller, and mystery have. And I guess you could also add horror in there, that usually horror comes with an inherent menace or dread or serial killer or whatever. But horror is another genre that can take a lot of different forms. So I'm going to say that's kind of in a middle zone. One of the great questions when you sit down to write a book is what is the secret sauce that keeps people turning the pages of a book, especially when not a whole lot is happening in a particular chapter. One of the questions that I most puzzle over as a writer, and that I see my fellow writers often struggling with, is how do you keep reader interest when you're writing a chapter where there's not some big thing going on? But on the alternate side of things, if every chapter has a big thing going on, it starts to become too much. And you can run the risk of overwhelming the reader, not giving them breathers, not giving them a chance to connect with the characters and actually care about them. Many good novels have those breather chapters where there's not something crazy going on. So how do you keep people like breathlessly turning the pages, even when you're in the middle of one of those kind of chapters? A month or so ago, I read The Valley of Amazement by Amy Tan. And this was a book that has been sitting on my shelf for a long time. And I've been trying to go through my TBR pile and just read everything that's been sitting around for a while, because I want to move. And before I do, I want to get rid of as many books as humanly possible so I don't have to lug them around. So I picked this book off the shelf. And as I've been doing with all my books lately, I gave it 50 pages or so to catch my attention. And if it wasn't doing the trick, it was going back to, thrift store, used bookstore, whatever. I started Valley of Amazement, and it was very hard to put down from almost the first page. I read the whole thing in like 3 days, and it's like a 550-page book or something. It's one of those books that I just was sneaking another chapter whenever I had a free moment to spare, because I was dying to know what happened. But a curious thing about this book is that a lot of it is told, not shown, including, we've had discussions about telling and not showing on this channel before, and why you do want a mixture of both. But including some scenes that could have really been fascinating if they were shown, but instead they were told. But it felt like it worked. Like the book was already pretty long, and I definitely was gripped by it, so it was doing its job. And one chapter particularly stuck out to me. So the premise of this book is we're in Shanghai in, I think, the 1910s, early 20th century. The protagonist is the daughter of an American woman who came to Shanghai after marrying a Chinese man. Something went wrong with the marriage. The girl has never known her father, and her mother is running kind of this high-end courtesan house, which is where businessmen get together and, talk deals and such. And both Americans and Chinese come to this house. But one day her father pays a visit, and she finds out that her mother actually has a son, and the son was kind of kidnapped almost by the husband's family, and her mother has never been able to see the son. And she really wants to see her son and have her other child. But there's some like political unrest and stuff. It's hard to get out of Shanghai. So anyway, she ends up kind of making this bad deal with this man she knows where he's going to get her daughter out of the country onto a ship, and then the mother's going to meet them on the ship, and they're all going to go to America to meet the husband and the son and all of that. But the man that she agrees to do this deal with is a shady dude who actually sells her daughter to a courtesan house in Shanghai and then lies and says that the girl died. This all happens pretty early on, and we get a chapter where she's arrived at the courtesan house, and one of the women working there is someone she already knows because she's from her mother's courtesan house. So she kind of becomes a bit of a mother figure to her. And we get a whole long chapter that is this woman telling her the rules for conduct for courtesans. That's all the chapter is. It's just going over all the things she can expect and the way she needs to behave and, you know, things she should do to protect herself and succeed in her new unwanted line of work. Nothing really happens in this whole long chapter, but it was incredibly gripping. And as I was reading it, I was thinking this chapter is like a masterclass in the art of anticipation. Because what makes this chapter so exciting is that we know she's going to be in a bad position. As we're reading all the rules for courtesans, we have to think in our minds about all the possibilities that she might face, all the dangers, all the, you know, there could be potential love and fortune and fame, or there could be utter ruin. There could be unwanted pregnancy. There could be betrayal. There could be jealousy between other courtesans. We're kind of presented with a huge array of possibilities, and that is building anticipation for what is actually going to happen. If you've at all, you know, seen anything, read anything about the power of dopamine, like why gambling is so addictive, or in my case, thrift store shopping. Part of what makes thrift store shopping so exciting is that it's the possibility we might win when we go into the thrift store, or we might lose. We could find the greatest treasure we've ever found, or we could come up empty-handed. The brain gets very excited by the possibility of the greatest highs and the lowest lows and not knowing which it's going to be. And that gets the dopamine going, the rush of what's going to happen. And then we get it, and then we kind of crash a little. And then we want our next hit of it. Understanding that is super important for keeping a reader hooked on books. If you want to know the power of anticipation, just think of any TV show that had two leads that had great chemistry and you wanted them to hook up. And then as soon as the show actually brought them together, it stopped being interesting. That's the power of anticipation, and also the power of losing the audience's interest if you give them exactly what they want without setting up the next thing for them to anticipate. And you can consider anticipation on multiple levels when you're writing. The macro level of anticipation is like your plot as a whole. We're talking like the book blurb that people read when they go to pick up your book on Amazon, or that, you know, the hooks that you might give them on social media. Those kind of get into your macro hooks. Your whole premise, perhaps, has some kind of inherent anticipation baked into it. Hopefully, it should. And that's why often the books that sell the best, especially right out of the gate, are the books that have what is called a high concept premise. Something that has an inherent sense of anticipation to it that makes people want to know what happens just based on like one sentence. Like The Hunger Games is a great example of a premise that is inherently laced with anticipation. Just the name alone, The Hunger Games, sounds ominous. And the premise of throwing a bunch of kids together in a reality show style competition for the death, even if you kind of go, ugh, a part of you also wants to know what's going to happen. Every book is not going to be The Hunger Games, however, and we'll get to that in a minute. Then we have the mid-crow, well, something between macro and micro. We have the middle types of anticipation. These are like not your main plot or your main hook, but they're the side plots and the like arcs that complete themselves but are not the main arc of the entire story. you can have little side threads that keep people's attention through slower parts of the book. One good example that you'll see in romance a lot is that oftentimes, as you have the main couple hooking up, you also have kind of a side couple that's also kind of interested in each other, flirting with each other a little bit, so that even after the main couple has gotten together, now you might throw some new exciting things to happen in the main couple, but you also have this other couple on the side where you've got people wondering, well, how are they going to turn out? And then you have your micro level anticipation, which is just like your scene level anticipation, something that is set up and resolved within a chapter or two, or like your really C level plots that just kind of tease the reader along with little smaller threads that they want to follow. Like one example of that kind of thing might be political intrigue that's going on in the way background of like a whole series, and it's not really like the macro plot in the sense that it's not like the main pitch of any individual book, but it also is kind of a through line that keeps people wondering how is like the greater backdrop of events going to turn out. And of course, on a scene level, you can probably pull any book off your shelf and look at a chapter and see little micro bits of anticipation. Now, Legends and Lattes is a book that's kind of known for not being tense whatsoever, so you would think it doesn't have a lot of anticipation. So how does it build anticipation while also being very low on tension? Especially because the whole premise of Legends and Lattes is setting up a magical coffee house. Therefore, everything that is set up, you pretty much can guess. Like a lot of the questions are things like, oh, a customer would like us to have food. Should we have food? What will the food be? Or, oh, a cat showed up. Are we going to adopt the cat? Are we going to name the cat? These are not the most gripping of questions, but I quite enjoyed this novel, as did a lot of other people. And I think one of the things that really worked with Legends of Lattes as far as building a sense of anticipation is that it jumps around pretty briskly between a lot of different little micro questions and characters. So even though you might not be like on the edge of your seat as to whether they're going to adopt a cat or not, it doesn't let you linger too long on that question. Just within one chapter, the chapter I randomly opened it to is the one where their eventual cat shows up. There's several different things going on in a very small word count, like maybe like 6 pages or something. You have the customer they're trying to please who is a little not sure, is not quite sold on the drinks, but would like them to carry food. You have the cat showing up. You have a character showing up who seems to be aware, perhaps, that she has a treasure that she's trying to keep hidden. You have the ongoing question of what's up with her employee, who seems to be kind of keeping some secrets. Just within, it's like 8 pages. Just within 8 pages, it's jumped around a lot between a lot of different micro questions, rather than having big, gripping Hunger Games type macro questions. The only real macro question is like, will her coffee house succeed? Which is not really a huge even question. You pretty much know it's not going to end in her just shutting her doors and going, well, another failed business endeavor. But at the same time, you want to know exactly how it's going to turn out, and it keeps you turning the pages simply because it throws many, many micro questions at you and switches them up frequently. So this kind of anticipation can come in 2 different forms. There's the Hunger Games type where we don't know what will happen and we want to see what happens. And you have the Legends and Lattes type anticipation where you do know what will happen, but you want to see how it unfolds. So before you begin a book, you might want to think about what are your macro questions, and are you aiming for the type of reader who wants to see what's going to happen because they don't know, or the type of reader who does know what's going to happen and simply wants to see how it's going to turn out, which is generally how a lot of romances and mysteries unfold. Although you can also kind of have both. If you have like a romance that has a lot going on, you might know that the 2 people are going to end up together, but also not know how like other side plots are going to work out, things like that. So it is possible to have both going on at once. But it can definitely be a struggle when you're not writing that high concept type of Hunger Games book to figure out what the anticipation is going to be, how you're going to sell people on it, and how you're going to keep their interest through those chapters where there's not some big moment going on. I really want my books to be more character driven these days, and the kind of thing where you really get to know the characters and feel like their world is real and you want to be there and hang out with them and you can imagine what that looks like. Those are the kind of books that I love the best, so it makes sense that that's the kind of book I would want to write. But at the same time, it poses a lot of questions as to how do I keep people excited to know what's going to happen when ultimately I want their main purpose for reading the book to be, I want to hang out with these people and I want to just hang out in this world, which is not a high stakes kind of situation. So my book, The Potion Dealers, is a novel that I struggled with for years. I first started writing about those characters in like 2003, and I didn't publish a version that I was happy with until last year because it was such a struggle figuring out how to structure the story in a way that it would have the proper types of anticipation. And well, there was a lot I had to sort out, but that was a big one. So this is what it boiled down to. The main character, Alfred, comes from an organized crime family. He's the heir to the whole organized crime empire that his father has built as the oldest son, but he's also been blind since infancy due to a curse that was placed on the family before he was even born, which has always thrown his inheritance into some doubt, but his parents still pretty much have gone along with him being the heir. When the book begins, his parents suddenly spring on him out of nowhere that they have a cure for the blindness curse, which throws Alfred for a complete loop because he's in his 30s when the book starts, and he was not even thinking at all that he wanted his blindness to be cured. He doesn't even know like what kind of life that would be at this point. Like his brain is already developed, but his parents tell him, you need to go find this girl because she is the daughter of the woman who cast the curse, and the only person who can break this curse is the original caster or the descendant of the person who cast this curse. So the anticipation in the beginning of the book is partly, is Alfred going to go through with it and what would happen if he did? And B, you pretty much know from the blurb that him and this girl are gonna feel some sparks, even though her mother cast a curse on his grandfather. So you have a little tiny bit of a star-crossed lover situation brewing. Then you have Livonia, the girl in question. When we meet her, she's living out in the middle of nowhere in a backwoods town, as far from an organized crime situation as you can imagine. And we learn that her parents died in this conflict between themselves and, people in Alfred's camp, kind of. And that she has an uncle that she's never met who has been writing her letters all her life, telling her to never leave her hometown. So we have a couple questions with her as well. Who is her uncle? Why has he never been to visit her? And why does he always tell her not to leave her home? So those are like your initial questions. Peru. So those are like your initial questions. As the story unfolds, your macro question for the whole book is going to be, can Alfred... So those are your questions early on in the book. But Alfred's questions are both of the, we know what's going to happen, but we just don't know quite how it's going to work out variety. Because you pretty much know from the blurb that he's not going to opt for the cure. He's going to remain the person that he's always been. Which then brings up the macro question. Can Alfred build up an organized crime empire selling magical potions on his own after his parents get really angry at him for not agreeing to be cured? And we know that him and Livonia are going to fall for each other, but how is this relationship going to work out between a country girl and a mob boss? Alfred's whole plan is to try to kind of approach various misfits within the magical community and persuade them to work with him, kind of positioning himself as, I'm a misfit too, and therefore you can trust me. So that's like the macro question of the series as a whole. Is Alfred going to be able to win over enough various misfits and weirdos in the magical community and cohere them together enough to become a top magic dealer. As macro questions go, I think these are not bad. That's why I finally feel pretty confident in this story after all the struggles that I had with it over time. If you've been following me for a while, I released this book in 2 different prior forms before the potion dealers, and I always felt like I was not quite sure I did it very well. The potion dealers, I finally feel like this is it. This does feel like the characters that I meant them to be and the plot that I meant it to be. But it's the kind of story where I want you to have a good time with these characters. I want more of a Legends and Lattes than I want a Hunger Games, although it's not as purely cozy and low stakes as Legends and Lattes. It's like 80% Legends and Lattes, 20% Hunger Games. You know what I mean? So one of the things that could easily trip me up as I'm writing is, how do I keep audience interest while I'm letting the book unfold with a lot of slice of life character stuff? Because that's the kind of book I love to read. That's the kind of book I want to write, but I also don't want to bore people. And the answer that I generally go with is to make sure that along with that macro question of, are Alfred and Livonia going to be able to build up this magic empire, I need to introduce constant mid-level and micro questions for the reader all the time, so that there's always something that you want to know how it's going to turn out, even if they're just having a fun little conversation in the moment. I try not to lose sight of those questions, that sense of anticipation. So very early on in the book, we find out that Alfred has a fiance, someone that he's been betrothed to in a business arrangement. That's a pretty common tropey obstacle for a romance. So when you find that out, you're probably thinking, okay, yeah, he's got some rich fiance that he needs to kind of get out of the way before he can get together with Livonia. But this fiance is actually super nice and is really, really into like women's rights and the rights of my race of doll people who've generally been a slave race. She's like really passionate about overthrowing the establishment, basically. So it's not quite as clear cut to just get her out of the way, because she's not like a rich bitch. She's actually like a super sweet, passionate person. So the question with her becomes, if Alfred gets together with Livonia, what will become of this poor girl who hopefully the reader is starting to like and care about and want to see stay on with the team? But where is she going to fit in? How is that all going to work? There's a question to follow. We also meet Alfred's bodyguard, George, who has been part of the family since Alfred was born, really. They have kind of lifelong appointments of these bodyguards for the families, like a loyal retainer. So George's father serves Alfred's father and so on. But pretty much as soon as we meet George, we kind of learn that he's not really that into violence and is a big nerd who's really passionate about music. And also that George has a mega crush on a girl who works at a coffee shop, but he never talks to her because he's a shy nerd. So you also have some questions posed about George. Is he going to talk to the girl at the coffee house? Is he going to stick around as a bodyguard? Is he going to fail at his job because he clearly hates it? Is he going to become a famous musician? What's going to happen with George? One of Alfred and Livonia's conversations fairly early on in the book is about the state of magic in the world currently. Livonia's been kind of living out in the boonies, so she's not super aware of what's going on in cities, but Alfred tells her that magic has become very commodified and that a lot of sorcerers now work basically in factories making mass-produced healing potions with catchy names and jingles on the radio and TV and stuff like that. The world is modernizing, and as such, what used to be this mystical realm that combined natural science, spirituality, discovery has now been forced into a lane of capitalism. Alfred is clearly very aware of what you lose when you take a discipline like magic and try to force it into purely a profit-driven kind of thing. And he tells her that the reason he's so passionate about continuing the family business is because he feels that they keep magic alive in providing a market for independent sorcerers to keep developing spells, even though they're often violent and destructive. It is what allows real magic to continue in a world that's starting to suppress it. So this also provides a real question and a motive for the business. Is magic a lost cause? Is Alfred going to be able to save magic? And then in every individual chapter, I try to make sure that there's always some little micro level of anticipation that always sets up the next small question. And those often feed into the larger questions I've discussed about different characters and where their plots are going and where the overall plot is going, and hopefully gets you more invested in each individual character as well as the overall mission. The chapter where Alfred tells Livonia about Healo Quick, the healing spell that you can buy at any corner store, and how increasingly sorcerers are just working to make Healo Quick instead of interesting new potions. Hopefully, that is a chapter where a reader really starts to want to see Alfred become the organized crime boss who has gathered together this team of misfit sorcerers. Simply because if you're a fantasy reader and you care about magic being interesting and weird and like mystical, you now feel kind of like Alfred, like, oh my gosh, I don't want magic to just be some mass-produced crap. I want to find all kinds of cool magic around the world and protect the people who are creating it and making it. Like, hopefully you're in his shoes a little bit in that moment. You're feeling like Livonia, who's kind of like, man, I really like this guy because even though he's in a like really shady business, his motive is very attractive. I don't want to see magic die. So when you're building that kind of anticipation, it's good to think about those kind of questions on multiple types of levels and how you can keep the reader invested in your characters and your plots, even when you're writing cozy stories, slice of life stories, slower paced, character driven, whatever. The kind of thing where you might not be thinking about gripping pacing quite as much, but how can you keep people turning the pages anyway? So those are some of my thoughts on pacing. I would love to know if you have any thoughts or tips about pacing, and also if there's any book that you really love that does not have a crazy high concept plot, but that you could not put down. Drop that in the comments. If you're new here, my name is Lydia Foxglove, and I am a fantasy author. And on this channel, I talk about the creative life in general, practical, emotional, financial, all aspects of the creative life, and the writing life in particular. So if that sounds good to you, click the like and subscribe, stick around. If you'd like more from me, I have a Patreon and a Substack that both have a free tier, or my members there or on YouTube memberships get 2 bonus videos from me every month voted on by you guys, as well as access to my Discord server, where we have a nice little community of writers and artists supporting each other through our endeavors. If you'd like to read any of my books, including The Potion Dealers, you can find that in the Hidden Lands link in my description. Those are the books that are like the most to me, but I also have a fair number of written to market paranormal and fantasy romance books. And my free book of the month this month is Captain Hook and the Mermaid, a fairy tale retelling that's very sexy, but also kind of touching. So you can find that link in the description as well. I post every Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern, as well as sometimes on Wednesdays. Thank you so much for watching, so much for supporting the channel, and I will see you soon. Bye!